Thank you, everyone. Hopefully you can all see the starting slide. Welcome to the first in the series of privacy masterclasses. This one is presented by myself and Malcolm Crompton. I'll leave it for him to introduce himself shortly. My name is Lyria Bennett-Moses. I'm the director of the Allens Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation, which is at UNSW Law. I'm also on the committee for IEEE SSIT Australia and other things that anyone who really cares can read my bio. This series is being conducted in the lead up to the New South Wales Privacy Summit on the 8th of May to help broaden the conversation with the input of the wider expert community. In other words, everyone who is on this call is part of a conversation that will be continued, and we really hope to get some input on our ideas and hopefully some new ideas that we can bring to that summit as well. We wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we now meet and pay our respects to their respective elders past, present and emerging. For the purposes of easing communication during today's session, can everyone please place themselves on mute for now and use the chat to raise any questions. The chat button can be located on the menu bar in the centre of your Teams window. Mark will then be acting as moderator and will raise any themes coming through. And in fact, if you have something you want to say when we have the discussions, Mark's going to help us moderate that as well. So just put your point in the chat and he'll use that as a basis for knowing you have something to say. We'll also have, so we will get verbal discussions as well, sort of mixed in with that. But for now, hold on to the chat. And oh, was that something? That was something. Okay. And also, just to let everybody know that today's event is being recorded for workshopping purposes. Okay, over to you, Malcolm.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us in numbers. So my name is Malcolm Crompton, and I'm the founder and lead privacy advisor at a consulting company called Information Integrity Solutions. And the only other part of my bio that's relevant for the moment is that in the beginning of the millennium, I was the Privacy Commissioner of Australia for 5 years, and I've been deeply interested in the issue ever since. I'm going to go on for a moment and just briefly introduce what this session is all about and not all about before I hand it back to Lyria to handle the first bit of content for the whole session. As Lyria said, this is input to the summit, invitation-only summit that's been put in place by the Minister for Customer Service in New South Wales. And therefore we're all inputs to that summit, and we will actually be preparing a very short 7-minute video out of today's masterclass that is a summary input into that summit. So that's how our input goes in on the day, on the Friday of Privacy Awareness Week, which is next week. The next thing that I'd like to be saying is that we have very deliberately, as designed by Ian Opperman at the Department of Customer Service, this is a masterclass. It's not a primer. We're assuming that the people who have joined do actually have at least some passing familiarity with the issues relating to privacy, but especially data privacy, which is 95% of what we're really talking about at the moment. We're not going to be going through privacy principles, or we're not going to be going through privacy laws either in Australia or around the world. We are going to be looking at 4 or 5 particular topics that we think are worthy of discussion at this time. Some of it is contextual to this whole coronavirus pandemic, and some of it is the more broadly moving arc of what's happening to that management of people's personal information worldwide and in Australia, and what's the best thing to do about it in the digital age. So we're going to cover really sort of 5 basic areas. The external basic environment, not really the privacy environment, but the external basic environment, the law and the rule of law, and some of the components that are needed to make that work. We're then going to look at the customer experience in the real world, which just reminds us that it isn't just the law that frames what's happening in the world around us. But we are then going to revert back to the complexity of the law and that put some lead in everybody's saddlebags that we would argue can perhaps be lightened. But then we return to the double whammy that we all face in our lives, even in Australia, which is the complexity in implementing law. So on top of the fact that some laws are unnecessarily complex or laws are tumbling all over each other and inconsistent, is the fact that implementation of law is often as problematic as the law itself. Having looked at those four areas, we then want to round out by privacy law in the 21st century as opposed to privacy law for the 20th century. And you will notice particularly there, but other points too during this presentation, Lyria and I happily disagree on a few things. And I think that's rich because it does mean that these are topics for discussion now and further resolution. And the societal balance that we reach has to be the product of conversation and discussion. With just watching what's happening on the whole COVID Safe app shows us how vital that discussion is. With that, I'll hand it over to Lyria to take us through the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Malcolm, and thank you everyone for coming. So I'm just going to start, as Malcolm suggested, with just some really high level stuff, what I would call the essentials. So data is wonderful. Everyone talks about all its practical applications for policy, for efficiency, for enforcement, for disease prevention, saving lives, you name it, data can solve it. But there's also lots of concerns. Now, there's lots of different lenses for looking at those concerns. You know, you can talk about human rights, you can talk about ethics, and many more. I want to, I suppose, take at this point what I would call a baseline approach. So we might want more than the baseline. We might want a lot more than the baseline. But my concern is that in the rush to do more interesting and exciting things with data, that at the very least, we don't want to sacrifice things that cost us a long bloody history to get in place. So it might not be enough, but it is fundamental. So one can argue over aspects of privacy law. People have different views on the effectiveness of different provisions of the GDPR, for example, and we're going to come to some, Malcolm's going to bring us into a conversation about 20th versus 21st century privacy law a bit later. But the possibility of arbitrary power being exercised is really not stuff you want to play around with. So this comes back to the rule of law, right, which is basically values we put in place, and some of them are on the slide, which we do in order to prevent arbitrary exercises of power. Now, I've put government and powerful actors there because I think it's not only government who can exercise power arbitrarily. Big private sector actors with lots of, you know, the digital platforms and so forth can also essentially make the rules for others. Smaller players, so the private sector more broadly, is really the bottom of the slide point. We expect them to obey the law, but we don't really worry about, you know, every single private sector actor exercising arbitrary power, because in most cases, whatever they do, we can just do something else. We don't need to use them. But there are private sector actors that can, and they would, I would argue, be under the same sort of idea and the same sort of principles as we want to apply to government. So what are rule of law values? I've put some of the main ones on the screen, and it sort of explained how they apply to, you know, data use. So transparency is, you know, you've got to be transparent about what data you're using, how it's being processed, how it's being used in decision making, so people can understand how powerful actors are using data. I've put narrow exceptions there because there are really important exceptions. So most nation states decide that they need some kind of spy agency that needs to operate with some measure of secrecy in order to, you know, protect us from whether it's terrorism or spies in other countries or other things, and they need to operate with a measure of secrecy. Otherwise, they're simply ineffective, and one can say the same thing for law enforcement in some contexts and so forth. So we can argue about those exceptions, but broadly speaking, the rest of government hasn't really got any reason to keep that kind of information from the citizens. Accountability is another one. Accountability for data practices, security and decisions made. Equal protection. So, and this is a little bit more complicated. So sometimes we don't want data factored in at all. If I do a search on Google for job ads, I don't want it to take my sex into account and only show me low-paying jobs. Similarly, I don't want the government to take into account my race in deciding whether I'm entitled to a benefit and so forth, with narrow exceptions, which is situations where we do want things factored in order to avoid disparate impact. So as a society, we might accept, for example, that the age at which vaccines are available will differ in Indigenous communities compared to the rest of us because of the fact that those diseases will otherwise have a higher impact in those communities because of existing health problems and so forth. So whether or not things like race, sex and so forth are factored in, we want to make sure that it is done in a way that ensures that people have equal protection. To the higher level point. We also want rules to be applied consistently so that citizens can predict how those rules will be applied. So there's sort of, I suppose, the baseline, right? Again, it's not even poking at privacy law. It's really saying this is what the fundamental bedrock of society needs to be. Okay, so how do we fall short? The first problem, I think, is the trust me problem. And it's really trust me rather than let me demonstrate my trustworthiness that's the problem. You can see this in some of the COVID safe rhetoric, but it's much broader than that. Government talks about trust a lot. They actually do talk about the importance of citizen trust, but they rarely talk about trustworthiness and what they're doing to achieve that. And I think it's important to have the conversation take place that way around. The other one is the suggestion that everything is always being balanced, right? That we can either have privacy or we can have security or we can have health or we can have safety or whatever the other thing is. Most of the time, the two things we're purporting to balance are in fact synergistic. So if you think about something like privacy and security, as a fairly obvious example, social engineering, which is a security threat, is easier the more you know about someone, which depends on how much, how well that person's data is protected. So these are not either ors. And when it comes at least to the baseline rules, at least to the need for transparency, accountability, and so forth, we need it for everything. We don't need to have to balance this in terms of when we're allowed to have it. So the baseline, if you like, is not worth sacrificing for anything, even security, health, and so forth. The next point is, the next way we can fall down is this idea of privacy doesn't matter or it's already gone. I think, people can talk about the extent to which privacy is dead. Barnaby Joyce, who I wouldn't otherwise quote often, was quoted in the Sun Herald as saying, "I treasure the government knowing as little about me as possible. There's always the argument, if you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to worry about. My argument is, if I'm of no concern, you need know nothing about me." But one can have these kinds of back and forths about, is privacy dead, isn't it? I think it's unhelpful, and it's particularly unhelpful if we're talking about the baseline stuff. In other words, the demand for transparency, accountability, equal protection, and so forth. Nothing is dead. Those things need to survive, including in how powerful actors handle our data. The next is the idea, well, it's okay, I've got consent. You ticked the I agree box, so therefore it's okay, I can do whatever I want. There's a few problems with this. The first is that consent itself requires transparency. You can't really make a sensible decision about whether to do something, whether to agree to something, unless you actually fully understand all the different uses which are going to be made with your data. And at the moment, quite frankly, privacy policies aren't delivering. Knowing that your data is going to be used for marketing purposes doesn't tell you very much at all. Knowing that your data is going to be used for health purposes doesn't tell you much either. So it's really a need to be transparent about the detail that matters, and something we should demand of any powerful actor to ensure that any powers, including powers we grant them by clicking I agree boxes, are not exercised arbitrarily. So the other problem is that consent doesn't work where it's an effective obligation. So consent doesn't work if I need to consent to the government using my data to apply for basic benefits to feed myself, for example. And I would argue consent isn't even the most relevant thing when we're talking about something linked to a community obligation, as in the context of public health. So I've actually spoken to many people who've downloaded the COVID Safe app who continue to have privacy concerns because they want to commit to a community, a community exercise. The point is, it's not just, oh, well, you consented, now we can do whatever we want. It should be consent is not really the main framework there. Consent also doesn't work where you're not competent to assess something. And we can see this again when we're looking at the COVID Safe app. So most people haven't necessarily read all of the commentary from the security experts, the legal experts, and everyone else to know, is this okay, right? So in a sense, saying we can do whatever we want because we consented isn't really the point. It's not enough. And consent and power more broadly, you can't really negotiate. And this is really coming back to my point about the rule of law as a means of constraining exercise of arbitrary power. If we're already talking about powerful actors, whether that's governments or large corporations running digital platforms in which everyone participates, realistically, consent cannot be the basis of sort of a waiver of what I'd call those fundamental principles. We want to make sure that they are retained, even if we agree to take part in, a government service, a large digital platform, and so forth. And the final point is my concern about secret keeping. And this is linked to transparency. Too often, I think we're told we can't know certain things and we aren't really told why, or we're given stupid reasons like commercial confidentiality. So we get to the debate about the COVID Safe app and transparency later on, but I suppose coming back to an even more fundamental concern I have is actually vote counting software. So vote counting software, which is just a very simple program, well, more complicated when you've got preferential voting and other things, but it's not rocket science program, is currently in most jurisdictions in Australia a proprietary product. Because it's a proprietary product, those jurisdictions say we cannot give you, security experts, the source code to test because we've signed an agreement with the provider and it's commercial in confidence. Now, to me, if we're talking about essential components of democracy like elections, I cannot see how some private corporations rights to confidentiality should possibly trump the ability of people to check the security of those tools, and for that matter, any citizen who wants to and can read the code to look at it if that's what they want to do. So I think there's a real concern with this move, particularly when the public sector engages the private sector to help them deliver a service, to then sort of get off the transparency hook, if you like. The next point I want to make is that there is often a choice. So robo-debt, and we'll come to that later, was a complete debacle. You can compare that to something like the Swedish student welfare system. So CSN manages this. It's for financial aid to students. They use an automated rule-based decision system mandated by national legislation. If an individual applies and, for say a reduction in debt repayments, an officer enters the relevant information into the system before letting the automated system take over, and a decision is then made. But when the system makes the decision, the officer at the agency is obliged by law to take responsibility for that decision and to, they get a draft letter rather than a final letter, such as the one issued in robo-debt. They have to review that draft letter, sign it, before it goes to the relevant customer. That's just a completely different framework. The accountability in a system like that is still there, whereas the accountability in something like robo-debt was ignored. In other words, the problem isn't that we're using data or that we're using automated systems. The problem is usually bad design of systems and extremely poor implementation. You can see the same point with COVID Safe. So there were choices here, right? And we'll come down to this later, but government made a particular choice to pursue, say, in this case, the Singapore app model with some adjustments, but it didn't really start with a question mark with the public. In other words, there was no public-facing dialogue about the different options, advantages and disadvantages, and why one was better than another, and we'll yet to see whether this really was a good design choice that maximises all of those fundamental core issues. The next point to make is that some things are simply not okay. And I'm not going to go into and explain the Compass tool in detail, but just to say, essentially, it's using machine learning with an all data type approach to make decisions about things like bail, sentencing and parole for people in the criminal justice system. So my response to that, and people can come up with all sorts of different things about it, but the big headline one to me is that probabilistic predictions about me based on all data that, you know, can be found that might be relevant should be treated as irrelevant for most government purposes. So the fact that people like me on some arbitrary variable are statistically more likely to commit crime should be irrelevant to how I'm treated by the criminal justice system. We shouldn't be labelling people as criminogenic because their parents divorced when they were a teenager, for example, one of the variables in the Compass assessment. This is, I should say, a US tool, although it has been trialled elsewhere. And we shouldn't be saying people are criminogenic. And even if we do want to say that, we certainly shouldn't act on it when we're making decisions about bail, sentencing and parole. And to my mind, that is true even if we are right on the statistics and the probabilities, which often we aren't. And I would add, it's not even really an issue about privacy, right? Many of the variables might be well known, you know, completely easy to find public variables. It's not even just a question about discrimination law, which actually doesn't protect people whose parents have divorced as a category, for example. It's a bigger question. It's about the rule of law and our right to equal protection before the law. And so we should insist on it, if you like, independent of almost any other consideration I can think of. Now, this idea of machine learning is inappropriate is not for all things at all times. You know, the risk involved in most cases in receiving inappropriate ads is usually infinitesimally low. And those, you know, it doesn't really matter. But sometimes it does actually. Job ads would be a good example of that, where it really does matter if people are seeing different ads. But the risk of being excluded from some income benefit is much higher. The risk of being sent to jail or spending longer in jail is even higher again. And ultimately, it comes back to power. What kinds of powers do we want to make sure are not exercised arbitrarily? That would include all state power and some private sector power, as discussed before. So, enough talking. The next thing I wanted to do, and I'm hoping this works on the screen, is, can everyone see the big slide? If someone can confirm, that'd be awesome. Okay, thank you, Malcolm. So this is a interactive activity. I don't know, Mark, if you've got any of this on the chat already, so maybe we could start there. But what I want to track is really get your input on all of these ideas. So first section is, what do you think of my list? Right? What's the stuff that really matters? The core stuff, the absolute, you know, can't do without stuff that is really, really important. The second box is for what is you know, what should be the no-go zones. I've mentioned, you know, the use of machine learning, data-driven approaches to certain kinds of decision making. What else is there? Where else should we absolutely not go? And the final one is really examples. We're going to, you know, we've spoken a bit and we're going to speak again about COVID safe. But what other examples are there that people sort of want to raise as really good examples? Times when, whether it's a private platform or the government has actually done a really good job of making sure all of these things are there, or bad examples, times when it's stuffed it up. Maybe some of the less familiar ones, you know, we've already mentioned things like robo-debt, which I think is always top of the list on this, but trying to get, you know, crowdsource for more. So Mark, is there anything on the chat for those boxes so far?
So we have a couple coming through, so I'm just reading them through. Government engaging in a discussion with the public before progressing with the development of the app. How would you envisage this being implemented? Are there established methods for government to do this?
Okay, that's a question which I will answer. It's a really good question. So what is really interesting to me is that government did all of this. In another universe at another time, there was something called the National Emerging Technology Strategy, and they had a subunit called the something about engagement. Anyway, national. Anyway, I can't remember what the abbreviation was or what it was for, but their whole job was about community engagement. They had different mechanisms, online mechanisms, in-person mechanisms. They had a whole series of principles for government engagement with the public, which included such sensible things as telling the public afterwards how what they said inputted into the process, or why particular ideas were rejected and were not considered able to be implemented. It included things like diversity. It included things like, the mix of online and offline, fast and slow. It took all of that into account. Because it was inside this National Emerging Technology Strategy unit, which was inside the Department of Industry, essentially when there was a reorganisation of government and that unit vanished, somehow the whole thing has been deleted from government memory, the internet, everywhere. But there are established ways. This particular unit spent 2 years developing a framework for community consultation. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's there. All we need to do is pick it up. With COVID safe, obviously there's a timing issue. You can't do a sort of full extended national engagement with meetings in every small town, but you can do things online. And allow people to comment online and share their ideas. You can even do it in ways where people can vote for other people's comments, so that the ones that are popular get pushed up, and you might say we'll only respond to things that have a certain number of votes. There are ways of doing it, and at least to hear people and let people participate in the conversation.
Larry, one thing that we have there is the need to cater for those people who are not digitally literate. And just while you're there, also, can you just clarify the first list for everyone again, please?
Okay, so the first list is really anything to add to my list. So I talked about the fundamental bedrock stuff, the rule of law values, transparency, accountability, equal protection before the law, predictability, consistency. Is there anything else really important? The bedrock stuff that needs to be added to that list. The things that really matter, that independent of anything else one can debate. I mean, my point, I suppose, is one can debate minutiae of the law. I kind of want to take it a step up. What are the things that absolutely, the core principles? And the second thing, Mark, was?
How are we catering for those people who are not digitally literate?
In terms of the consultation?
No, the need to cater for those people. So that's one point that's been raised.
Oh, as something for the list?
Correct, yes.
Oh, okay, yep. Excellent. Hold on.
And we also have another one. What about privacy? Sorry, I'll let you.
Yeah, somehow it's, there we go. I might just put that under the heading of diversity as a broader heading, and then say need to need to consider.
And just while you're doing that, Lyria, I'll just let you know that Ian Ockman's also joined. So my apologies, I had tech challenges getting onto this.
Ian, you should never have tech challenges.
Thank you, Lyria.
And just while you're there, Lyria, also been raised, what about the privacy impact assessments? OAIC guidelines on PIAs strongly encourage public consultation.
Yes, agree. Although this particular PIA for COVID safe, it was done by Maddox, which is a law firm, and I certainly wasn't aware of any public consultation that they engaged in the course of doing that. But yes, so is that a comment, or is that to put?
This is Malcolm here, and that's really precisely the point. There are a number of things you could say about the Maddox privacy impact assessment, and it does reflect some good practices. But it's also got some significant shortcomings, including the fact that the only people it consulted were effectively federal agencies, maybe state agencies as well, but the general public, external experts, advocate groups were all not consulted. And that's not good practice for privacy impact assessment.
Just while you're going there, Lyria, so a couple more. Ollie has raised ambiguity, and the clarity of the data collection can be interpreted in unexpected ways.
That's an extremely good point. If you think about some of the countries run by dictatorships, there's usually more shelf meters of law in those countries than there is in any other part of the world, and hence the laws can be arbitrarily and ambiguously interpreted, regardless of what the law says. It's the interpretation of the law. We only need to mention one author to have a full understanding of that, and their word is Kafka.
Okay, I think that might be a slightly different point to the one that Mark was raising from the comments. Mark, is that the same point?
So we've got Ollie there. Ollie, I just check with you, ambiguity. So clarity of the data collection can be interpreted in ways that are not expected. That's what he's got there.
Ollie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just wondering, sometimes the these interviews or questionnaires are quite open-ended, and they could direct you to a particular in a particular direction. And I haven't seen many with the government type questionnaires coming out, but I've seen it with these people in the market that do some surveys, and you get directed to a particular kind of outcome or answer. And that's what I'm trying to get at, that you can answer in two ways, or you can answer and the results can be interpreted any way they want. And so that's why I don't like to get onto these questionnaires, because that's what they actually try and do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I've again, just trying to put it at a high level, Ollie, would it be fair to say that bringing yours and Malcolm's point together, it's about interpretation, whether that's of law and the application of law, or in your case of data, has to be both honest and good faith, but also competent?
Yeah, it's got, I don't know how you verify a set of questions, but there are so many techniques that people can use to shape a questionnaire that actually takes you in one direction.
I might add that to the examples too. That's a really good example. So questionnaires.
And I find that a big thing in the market these days. They tend to get you in a particular direction, and often you have to read through that what they are trying to ask you, or don't answer it at all. Because if you just answer it based on your just your perception right at the start, you may end up saying something that you didn't actually mean.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's a good example one. Thank you.
Also, a point raised by Kelvin, how to balance the public benefit with public risk.
Yeah, so I would argue that and that was my point about the balance scales earlier, that absolutely you can have those conversations about anything, and we'll talk about it in a little while about COVID safe. But I would argue that no balancing exercise can possibly replace core rule of law values. In other words, you can't sort of say, oh, we can have a bit of arbitrary power over here if it just protects a few more people and saves lives. That's a balance I'm not comfortable with at the level of the specifics. So if you're deciding, for example, do I download COVID safe? There is a balancing exercise there. Absolutely. But I think at the level of the core baseline principles, I'm not sure I can imagine anything that would be on the other end of the scale for those.
So Kath has just raised a point to that point that was raised by Kelvin as a baseline. What is the need for each cohort of users? What is the public benefit, and how credibly are both of these evidenced?
Okay, can you say that again slightly more slowly?
To Kelvin's point, as a baseline, what is the need for each cohort of users? What is the public benefit, and how credibly are both of these evidenced?
Yeah, so that is, I suppose, that's a kind of, I suppose, a headline for that might be just sort of saying necessity, or as it's sometimes called in privacy law, reasonable necessity, right? Do we actually need to do this? And not just say we need to do it, but credibly justify and evidence it. That's a really good point. Yep.
Lyria,
Sorry,
Lyria, I was going to say, against your slide about the essentials, have we put in some concept of independent arbitrator, whether that independent arbitrator is actually a formal court system or a regulator is less the issue than if said rules are applied consistently and consistent citizens can predict, but they also need some trustworthy process to do that. So
I'm
that's
going
why
to
we
put
have
that under the
courts.
heading of accountability, Malcolm. So accountability, and all of those words have whole books written about them. But accountability, I think, in every book includes some kind of independent oversight.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Yep.
Kath also raised a good example, the UK GDS, open source products and platforms that have contributed greatly to the Australian federal landscape, example, Marketplace and Notify, also traced together, code curated by Singapore open source community.
Who was that from? Cass?
Kath T.
Kath T. Do you want to come in on that one? That sounds like a really interesting example.
Oh yeah, hi, Kath Thompson here. Yes, as you probably know, the DTO that was its early days quite close to GDS, and GDS believed quite strongly that anything that was built with taxpayers' money for public benefit should be open and accessible to the public, and therefore that the source code should be exposed. And I think that it's central to say that if you then use it, and you fork the code, then you publish any amendments and enhancements you've made to it back to the repository so that others in their turn can benefit, which seems to be also the modus operandi of the Singapore team that put together that created Trace Together. That's
a really good example, actually. I like that. And I would argue Australia should do exactly the same thing, the same principle. Any digital platform built for the public should be open source.
Yes, there was one occasion where we went to open source something, not in federal, but they said, when you're making sausages, why do you talk about the sausage making process? And I said, well, actually, we're not. We're making software. But I think that there's fundamental misunderstandings in quite a few areas.
Yes, and the appropriateness of sausage analogies probably stretched a bit too far. But yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot to say for that. That the idea that that there's no reason to have. It might be that the public can't see some things. It can't see data on secret squirrel databases held by ASIO, for example. But there's absolutely no reason that a proprietary interest should intervene with the public getting transparency from government.
So we've got a point there, just that Notify from GDS also is used by Canada. And just another point, so as a fundamental baseline, what about democratic values? Rule of law crosses many different legal systems. And that's been echoed here to say that values that underpin a society are even more fundamental than laws. And while amorphous, very important to discuss in the public fora continuously.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I mean, yes. So you can have rule of law without having democracy. You can't, I don't think, have democracy without having rule of law. I agree that democratic values would be absolutely the next essential layer. But yes, one could argue that that's a very high-level political, theory debate or something. But yes, I think democratic values. Yes, certainly in Australia. Absolutely.
And maybe the last point before we move on due to time there, Peter has raised, you mentioned that there are differences between 20th century and 21st century privacy law. Presumably, it will continue to evolve, so we will need a way to continue to keep data privacy and related policies and tools up to date over time.
We will come back to what we mean by 21st century privacy law and how that will look. So is there anything else from the comments to include in this? We had nothing on the things people didn't like. Everyone's very happy. Is that, we'll close there?
Just a late one there from Peter. I'm just reading this through, sorry. Accountability must be adjacent and as in automatic, self-executing, such as though ongoing independent oversight, as is reasonably practical. Expensive and delayed process for judicial review doesn't really address when someone has moved fast and already broken something.
Yeah, yeah, definitely true. Again, I suppose I've just used the heading. The books that sit under these concepts, should absolutely include that. Justice delayed is justice denied. So thank you, everybody, for helping us expand our list and come up with some really awesome examples, both good and bad. And so we will take that in to the next to the Privacy Information Week, and meanwhile on to the next topic. Over to Malcolm. I got to get the
Lyria is the slide boss here, so I have to ask Lyria to move the slides for me at times. As I said at the opening, the customer experience matters a lot. So in a sense, it doesn't matter what the law says if the customer experience is weird. So one of the things that I wanted to make us think about was abstracting from the law, and whether we're a citizen or a client or a customer or anything else like that, we're actually as individuals facing the same set of issues. And it often arises because the organisation that we're dealing with is focused always on success. They've designed success pathways. They've got a user experience. They know what good looks like. It's amazing how often the best laid plans go wrong, and there's nobody home to deal with those misadventures. So that, particularly, say, for example, in aircraft safety, there is very conscious planning for when things go wrong, as well as when things go right. Just think about the fact that there are life rafts built into the airplane, that every seat is actually afloat, so that you can actually use it as your personal float beyond the thing that they ask you to be able to put around your neck. There's all sorts of arrangements in place in some circumstances for when things go wrong. But if you look at the fragile digital world that we're in, so often we can see that things look really good if you know what's going on and everything's working perfectly and the broadband is broad and everything else is going right. But what happens when things don't go so well? We've all got myriad examples, and we could have a workshop celebrating and denigrating the myriad examples that we have. I've just put up there 3. You know, think about the hour it took you to fill a shopping cart, and then the page hung, and your hour of work on the shopping cart has just disappeared out the door, and you've got to start again. Think about the number of times when you've got something strange happening, you can't get your computer to work, or the shopping cart doesn't work, or you can't load something that it plainly says you can load, or the Zoom or the Teams freezes, or just about, or you want to submit information and you can't, or your name is longer than the field length that's available. You know, so a lot of us are very lucky to be called Smith or Brown or Wu or Tang, but a lot of other people have got hyphenated names that won't fit on the form, and then the system will confuse the John Smithers Brown with the Joan Smithers Brown because it can't fit Smithers Brown into the field. All sorts of things like that. We don't want to go and create lists of that now, to take far too long. The point is, it's happening all the time. And if you think of it in statistical terms, the probability of something like this eventually happening in any circumstance is 1. It's an absolute certainty. And yet it's not planned for. Sometimes it doesn't matter, sometimes it does. The point that I particularly wanted to make here, though, was that there is in fact a very useful spectrum to think about that is often not focused upon, which is, if you think about how a person is leading their life, wants to engage in something in the world around them, whether it's the government or whether it's Google or whether it's you know, some new chat room or anything like that, the first thing that happens is curiosity. You know, you're just looking around. Then you might ask a question. There might be some inquiry, and you might look it up, or you might actually get in touch with the entity. That's followed by the action. You know, you might purchase something, you might install it, you might fill in the form, you know, who knows what the action is. But then things aren't going right. At that point, you want help. That's what you're doing. You just want help. You might be worked up about it, or you might not be, but you just want to help. You want to solve the problem. If the help doesn't work, you begin to get into the complaining mode. You're going to complain to somebody. And usually the best thing to do is to complain to the entity that's not working very well with you. If that doesn't work, you want to complain to the regulator, and it can end up in literally a see you in court process. If you think about it, though, that spectrum is written that way because the further to the left that the spectrum that you can keep it, in other words, at the curiosity, inquiry, stage, if necessary, out to the help stage. It's cheaper for the entity in solving the problem. It's best for the entity's branding that it's fast at solving problems. It's cheaper and more convenient and less stressful for the consumer. Everybody wins. And you can make more of the upsetting moments fit closer towards the left end of the spectrum the more you've thought about and planned for failure. And that's one of the takeaways that I think can come from today, that a greater focus by any entity on planning for failure and understanding the user experience when things are getting a bit difficult or getting really damn difficult is something that would, I think, make the world around us rapidly, more easily, happily better. I just don't understand why it's not thought about more often. The other thing is that this is often made worse in the new world that's been so facilitated by the internet, which is the concept of the supply chain. There has always been a supply chain of some sort, even if it involved camels bringing something over from China into the Middle East and on into Europe. There have always been supply chains. What we've done is made them more instantaneous, more fragile, and more all-pervasive in our lives. And there's some interesting language in that. The supply chain, when it's delivering, when it's being successful, brags about, brands itself, claims to be a single concept that just delivers it to you. The computer in the bag with the loaded software that works, ready to turn on, just take it away, Sam. But as soon as something goes wrong, each of the links in the supply chain suddenly disappear and disconnect from each other, and you're left with dealing with the links separately and individually and solving the problem for yourself as to which link do I deal with to solve my problem. Again, easily fixed. If something wants to brag about being a supply chain, it needs to be at home and competent and saying there's only one phone number, one internet connection point to go for any of your problems. We'll take on board the complexity of solving the problem and dealing with the correct link in the chain. The point I'm making is that in the government world, in the commercial world, we have serious deficiencies in the customer experience, made often worse, not better, in the digital world compared with the long-term world, pre-digital meat world, or whatever you want to call it. The next slide is basically, I've called it customer experience 2. And I make the point that sometimes these obscurities are by design and sometimes it's by accident. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Well, I do want to go very quickly through the archetypical case study that we all know about at the moment. Given that we're running short of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on robo-debt, but I have listed there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 separate black dot points on what went wrong in robo-debt. And it's quite controversial as to how many of those are obstructions and obscurities and damaged customer experience by design, and how much of them are just bad luck and incompetence. But it's a stunning study in how many ways you can build a bad system, even though most of it was actually legal. So we need to see how the customer experience, abstracted of the law and interacting with the law, becomes complex. And I think I probably don't want to spend any more time on it than that, given that we're beginning to run out of time. What I wanted to do next, though, was do the same sort of thing as we've just done with Lyria. And Lyria will actually type it up for us. We're going to go through a 2-stage process. The first thing is Mark is going to give us a link. Now, where is that link? Mark, is it in the chat room?
Just been added to the chat.
Just been added to the chat. If you click on that link, you're going to be asked to fill out a very simple survey. And we'll, after a minute or so, we'll come back and give you the results from the survey. Now, it could be that Mark is able to take over the screen at this point and publish the survey results for us.
Here we have some values coming through. There's people filling this in.
Wow. I'm glad we've let this run for a while, Mark. The current results are somewhat different from the first results. So how many respondents have we had so far there, Mark?
We've had 30 so far.
30
people come through.
respondents so far?
About half.
Wow. Look at the 50-50 split on how many people in this webinar have downloaded the app. And in fact, we're moving more towards the no side than the yes side as the numbers come on through. So all the yes people seem to have filled in their yes vote pretty quickly, and no people are still musing on it and then giving us some of their answers and reasons.
Malcolm, in fairness, that's the structure of the survey, because we ask more questions of people who say no.
Yeah.
So it's faster. So I don't know if it's, it would be a skewed data inference to say.
Fill the space. Oh no, Mr. Opperman, who's Mr. Data, is looking at our survey and he's probably going to drive some holes in it. Mr. Opperman, we're going to ask you not to join in and drive holes in our survey because we know how bad it is. This is instantaneous finger on the pulse, wet finger in the air stuff.
That's absolutely fine, Malcolm.
If you did want to say something, please feel free to say something, but I suddenly got a cold sweat break out when I saw that you might say something.
Before we get to any Q&A session, I might actually introduce myself and why we're running the session. And again, my apologies for being late, but I'm happy just to sit here and enjoy the show.
Thank you, Ian. Ian's the mastermind behind these masterclasses, and Mark Portlock and ACS have been kind enough to actually turn dreams into reality. Mark, it's very small on my screen, so if you could just read us the results and we'll draw a halt on it at that point.
Sure. Just the last one coming through. So we've had 45 responses so far. That's about 2/3 of the group. So roughly about 42%, which is the yes, they have downloaded, and 58% saying no, they haven't. Of those people that have said no, are there any other safeguards? So 10 people, so 38% are saying no, nothing would persuade them, with 17 saying yes, additional safeguards would. So that's 63%, sorry, saying yes. And of those safeguards that people are looking at, the top priority are the independent authority and continuous audit. Second, coming a full act of Parliament. And third, independent governance, oversight and enforcement. That's how it's playing out.
Wonderful. So again, what we will do in our 7-minute video for the summit when it's been held, we'll put in some data that comes from that survey. I don't know whether the survey can stay open for a little bit longer for anybody who wants to come in late, but at some stage we'll have to draw a halt on to gathering data into the survey. But right now, if we go to the next slide, Lyria.
I've got a rest control. Hold on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, bang the button and rest control. There it is. We felt that inflicting a 2-hour webinar on anybody was beyond human endurance. And so what we're going to do right now is pause on the presentation and allow people a 5-minute break. So in other words, at 5 o'clock, we will resume. And allow ourselves a comfort stop or boiling the kettle or open up whatever favourite beverage that you have, or you can do anything else, including possibly even talk to your kids. Lyria and I will stay on here, and if people want to unmute their audio and ask us questions, then instead of doing chat just for the next 5 minutes, let's open up the mics and see what people would like to ask us about, and we'll see if we can give some answer, just an informal discussion before we move on to the next part of the presentation. It's always the first question that's the hardest. Once the first person has bothered to ask a question, then the questions will pour in. So who wants to go first? Maybe everybody's raced out the door to boil it.
I'll have a go then. It's Jenna here, Lyria, Jenna Churches.
Hi.
Hi, I found it you know, the list that you began with the sort of the rule of law principles, obviously I'm in favour of those principles, but what I found intriguing was your next discussion went on to trust and trustworthiness. How do, you know, rather than just blanket trust, how should you trust us, or these are the reasons why you should trust us? And I wondered if you could just speak a little more to and if there is a correlation, the correlation between those rule of law principles and that trustworthiness.
Well, I think there's a very strong relationship. So in other words, if you live in a country like Australia, where the rule of law is relatively strong, generally speaking, you mostly trust government, right? I don't mean in everything. I don't mean certainly when it comes to competence in all things, but just in the very basic sense of you assume that it's probably not going to work to bribe the driving test person or whatever, right? That most of the time things work, according to the rules, and most of the time the government will do things the right way. If you live in a country that has not got as strong a rule of law, that level of very basic trust goes down. Now, trustworthiness I'm not saying that the rule of law is the only thing, the only factor when it comes to trustworthiness, but it is trustworthiness not to exercise arbitrary power, which, as I would argue, is a sort of very basic fundamental thing we would hope governments would do. If you want trustworthiness as to competence or other things, that's when you can start adding more detailed requirements in. And I absolutely think we should do that. I don't think we should stop at the rule of law, but I do think the rule of law is a sort of core base for just trustworthiness in government at all, which in many countries doesn't exist.
I would add, Jenna, that trust is extraordinarily contextual. At one level, it's trust who to do what when. So I will trust the doctor to be dealing with my body, but I'd never give my doctor the motor car to fix. I'd always give my motor car to the motor mechanic to fix, and I'll never ask the motor mechanic to do anything about looking after my body. So even though you can say that the motor mechanic is highly trustworthy, you're putting a very narrow context around that, and certainly not talking about the motor mechanic's competency or trustworthiness with regard to anything medical. So that's one thing. The other thing is, how is a trust relationship built? And there's a really interesting book that I think is 15 years old or something like that, called Trust from Socrates to Spin. And it's written by a philosopher in England called Kieran O'Hara. Still available on the various online bookstores to buy. I would really recommend having a read of it. The book is seriously interesting because it starts off literally page 1 saying, in Britain at the time, we trust Tony Blair with our lives, but we also know he's a serial liar. He will lie to us. He has lied to us. It's proven. So again, why did people trust Tony Blair in a circumstance where he was a known liar? And Kieran unpacks all of that. And then he goes into another completely different scenario and says, why and how do we trust a doctor? Quite often, the only things we require to trust in a doctor is a white coat and a stethoscope dangling around the neck. And this person is going to ask all sorts of questions that would otherwise be embarrassing and inspect all sorts of parts of our bodies that we'd never show to anybody. And yet we do it with a deep trust. And he tries to unpack why that's the case. He always describes that as the unique case, although I don't think it's as unique as that. He goes through a number of other quite different kinds of examples. And in the end, what's interesting for a person trying to think about all this so deeply, he says, I don't think I can find a unifying theme. It's really worth getting hold of that book and having a read. It's interesting. It's a relatively easy read. And in a sense, it messes with your mind rather than solve things for you. But it's a classic case of we can try and make it too simple and therefore get it wrong.
Malcolm, is it worth putting that book in the chat? Malcolm, is it worth putting the book in the chat? The name?
Yes, I'll just go round to the chat right now and type it in there. So anybody who's interested, here it goes.
Malcolm, perhaps I can add a couple of comments as well. You made some good points about failure and planning for failure. I was chair of the NATA software testing committee. So, and basically it was operating where independent test labs would, in certain areas, be appointed to look at quality and so on of IT systems. But the areas where that was mainly applied in were areas that were regulated. And so, for instance, our ACS program, where there are security protocols for secure devices with government, our gaming systems, and then there's other spin-off areas that weren't covered under NATA, things like PCI compliance and so on. And I guess, you know, that's a challenge with our industry is, you know, quality is not absolute. There's balances to be made. When you sort of assess, even I came out of the safety critical sector, you're not making a guarantee. It's more, have you taken enough measures to address the issues and address the risk? Not so much that you're guaranteeing the product. And I guess, you know, in many ways, you talk about the digital sector and the IT more broadly. And you know, I'm a fellow of the ACS and a lifelong advocate of the ACS. But I often lament that our profession in technology really doesn't have that level of influence and professional association that we might see through law and engineering, where basically we need accredited professionals as part of that trust element.
Look, that business of credible authorities is really, really interesting. I don't know what I did wrong, but for about 12 years I was sentenced to working in Department of Finance in Canberra. That's actually being a joke because it was extraordinarily stimulating and interesting work. But sometimes Department of Finance just got far too dry. They were basically saying that the whole world of the medical profession is far too over-regulated. Anybody should be able to claim to be a doctor rather than have to pass any particular professional tests, and that the marketplace would sort out the shysters from the genuine. I think most of the world would think that that was absolute rubbish. And at the moment, we've got the same challenge with data generally, whether it's personal information or any of these other things. The business of ensuring something is secure, and I won't define secure for the moment, more progress has been made in objectively defining what needs to be secure, how you test for security, and how you set up a security professional. In the world of data protection and privacy, it's much less mature. The International Association of Privacy Professionals has a whole lot of certified statuses that you can get. It's beginning to gain traction. It's still a pretty low level, going from novitiate to novice qualification rather than anything serious. Some of the other professional societies have also entered this field, but there's a long way to go before we have a serious framework in place that is credible for those who are genuinely professional in handling some of these matters in a way that just because you see the certificate, you can rely on it. I could go on. And same thing about, we'll actually discuss this more in the discussion later on today. But there's a lot that can be done yet to have genuinely credible, where you don't have to question the professionalism of what's being done, and there's not much of it in data at the moment.
Malcolm, should we go back to?
I think we should.
The main event. So we've got a little bit more content to get through, and then a sort of long period of discussion at the end. So the last hurdle is before you, and then we'll have a really good discussion about the law and more at the end of this. So I wanted to. Oh, that didn't work. You ruined my slide, Malcolm, when you fixed it. It's meant to. I don't know. Maybe I have to. Hold on. Let me show you this again.
Worked as I sent it. So
it worked.
If I have.
Oh no, it's working again. It's me. I stuffed it up. It's not you. It's me. It's all good. I had it in some weird mode or something. Anyway, okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the complexity of data law. And I think this is a really important challenge. So I guess by starting with those core principles, right? Accountability, transparency, etc., they don't enact themselves. at the end of the day, what you've got to look at is the detail, right? You've got to actually look at what the law says people can and can't do. What you want is for those laws taken as a whole to provide a framework which guarantees the accountability and so forth. So that was kind of what I was trying to say about accountability before. I use the word accountability. If I just say that and stop, in a sense, nothing happens. But if I, create oversight agencies, I create systems, then I can say this system as a whole that we have created, including through law, is a way of ensuring accountability. So we actually have to do things with law. In Australia, and not only Australia, but I'll focus on Australia, the law is really, really complicated. The first challenge we have is just federalism. So we have we have the Privacy Act, for example, at the Commonwealth level, and other laws that impact on what data can be used at the Commonwealth level. We have, each state, not all of them have a proper Privacy Act. Some do, some don't, some have other kinds of instruments. But you have state laws. Those state laws will have one law, one law, general privacy type thing, act or whatever, as well as a whole bunch of other data laws. So already federalism makes things complicated before we even go to all the other things that make it complicated. The next thing that makes it complicated is what I'd call agency-specific rules. So these are rules that govern how particular agencies can use data, either what data they're allowed to take in, what data they're allowed to send out. And there's a whole bunch of these, right? So most law enforcement and national security agencies will have their own rules about how those agencies handle data, but it's not just that. There are special rules for education data and this, and so forth. But even where you have one agency, often within that, there are data set specific rules. So it's not that one agency even just has the same rules that govern all the data held by that agency. Different data sets managed by that agency will be subject to their own rules. COVID Safe's a good example of that. It's data that is going to be processed by mostly state and territory health departments, as well as the sort of Commonwealth Department of Health in the middle. But it has its own rules. It has its own determination that governs exactly what can and cannot be done with that data. But it's not only COVID safe. NAPLAN data has its own rules that separate it from all other education data. Electoral rolls have their own rules that separate it from other data that might be held by electoral agencies and so forth. So there's a number of these, right, as well. So you've got the main stuff, just sort of recapping, which means each jurisdiction will have a general sort of privacy law, plus often specific ones that might deal with health data or other categories. You've then got agency-specific rules that tell particular agencies how they're allowed to handle data, data set-specific rules even within that. You've also got layers. So in each of these categories, you might have an act, regulations, rules, guidelines telling you how to interpret those rules, regulations, and acts, ministerial directions, or as we've recently seen, determinations, allowable, disallowable, and non-disallowable instruments, and so forth. But you've got an even more problematic layer. Somewhere after all of those things, right, you've actually got a layer that's really important and that you're not even allowed to see. And it's what I'd call the internal and MOU layer. So whatever the rules are, right, that exist that you can get your access to, there's this additional layer. So agencies, well, most law enforcement officers, for example, won't have read the rules about how law enforcement has to comply with different data rules. It won't have read the State Privacy Act. It won't have read, the officer probably hasn't even read their own act, the relevant policing act. But they will have some kind of manual about what they're allowed to do that sits inside that agency that you can't see if you're outside that agency, including to check that it accurately reflects the law as it is. We have to sort of trust them, but that will actually govern what actually happens in practice, right? That's the coalface document. MOUs will exist between agencies, right? So there was an MOU where the federal department, which was meant to be doing a whole bunch of big data stuff, had an MOU with state agencies doing foster care stuff. And that was just all done through an MOU. They just agreed that data would be able to be shared so it could be analysed. I should add, as a very small side note, that was an exercise that was completely screwed up. Whoever did it did all the misleading stuff about how you read data, but you wouldn't have even known what the rules were for it because it's an MOU. And if you go into an agency and say, can I see all the MOUs you have with other agencies about data sharing, they won't let you see that. Now, those agreements actually specify all the kinds of things you would want to see in acts, regulations, guidelines, rules, and so forth. In other words, they actually say what has to be done to the data, what kind of data sharing is okay, what is not okay, how securely it needs to be stored, whether it can be shared on with other agencies, and so forth. Nothing. You cannot see any of it, which really is a huge transparency problem. But even just on the complexity problem, which is where we are now, it's also additional layers, additional sources of rules that are governing what's actually going on with everyone's data. Then all of these things change, right? So you can get your handle on it one day, but all you need is for New South Wales to amend their Privacy Act, and suddenly it's a new set of rules. Now, this makes things really complicated if you're trying to understand what the current regime is. Most of the time when people analyse privacy law, they just pick something. Let's analyse the Commonwealth Privacy Act and look at how that should be amended or whatever. But the challenge isn't just in one act, because data moves between state agencies and federal agencies, data moves between public sector and private sector, data enters people who are under exceptions to the Privacy Act, but then may even get governed by state law if they're doing work for a state agency and so forth. So it's really, really a big mess. Now, this might be okay if we had some kind of basic standards. So you could even assume you could read one and the others were just local enactments of something very similar. But that's not the way it works. In fact, even at the very basics, you've got massive amounts of terminological confusion. So let's just look at how we link entities, whether that is an agency or a corporation or an individual, with data for which that entity has some kind of responsibility under some kind of law, or some kind of power under some kind of law, right? A power to share it or do something with it, right? So this is very core basic, because if you don't know which entity links to which data, then you can't even begin to work out which is the right rule to apply, right? So absolutely core and basic. Now, you would think we don't need a lot of words to do that, right? Linking entities and data, we can do that quite simply. Wrong. So what this table shows is all of the terminology that was used in legislation, and just to limit the exercise, I only looked at legislation that could link a law enforcement agency with information/data, right? So it's not all the legislation out there. It's a limited set. It doesn't deal with education data or health data or whatever else. It's just the legislation dealing with law enforcement agencies, plus the general laws that also apply to law enforcement agencies. And you can see how many words we're using just to do that very simple exercise, some of which is completely ridiculous, like possession or control, with control defined in terms of possession or control, or combining words in weird and interesting ways, like control of the custody of. So we have all of this language. We have some language that's just completely unhelpful. Property law language, like possession or property or owned or of or its, none of that actually should be applied at all to information, because according to Australian law, information simply is not an object of property rights. So if you want to apply those words, you have to do it without property law to help you, which actually makes no sense. Other language like hold, which is used in a lot of privacy law, also makes no sense. I can hold a pen. I can't hold data, right? Now, it might be really easy if data is on a piece of paper sitting in my filing cabinet, we can say, I hold that data. But as this gets more and more complicated, when we have shared platforms, cloud providers, complex legal arrangements about data, a word like hold, a physical grasping word, isn't very useful at all. So what we need is simplified language. Even just this, we can't get right. How many distinct concepts actually are there? We use all of these words. How many do we need? I counted 4 that we need. You need a word to talk about availability. In other words, people who are entitled to access data and what their responsibilities are, like not accessing it unless they need it or something like that. You need a word for when an entity has accessed, used, processed data, right? Because you want to make sure they have to keep it secret or they can't use it for certain purposes or whatever. You need a word for that kind of relationship. You need a word for control, the entity that is primarily responsible for that data, the one who can change the data, edit it, delete it, etc. That usually will be a one-to-one relationship, or is more likely to be a one-to-one relationship than all the other categories. And you need a category for possession, not of the data, because that makes no sense, but possession of a physical medium on which data is stored. In other words, who controls the server, and they might have responsibilities for security or whatever else. So you can put different kinds of responsibilities onto entities depending on which of those 4 categories they are in. I cannot see any other word or combination of words, if we go down to the bottom list, that covers something that is not in those 4. Malcolm, you have a word?
Rights. That it's actually the rights that you have that matters. So, and I'll do the real estate example. Even though you own the real estate and you have the right to do all sorts of things with the real estate, other people also have rights over that real estate. The electricity people and the easement rights that they have, the water people and the easement rights that they have, the council and the council's rights to levy rates on you. There's lots of rights. There's a place in Vienna. In Vienna, the lease on the property is worth more than the ownership of the property, because the lessee has more rights than the owner of the property.
Okay,
so
right.
The value of the rights. So I think with data, it's rights is a word to consider.
Okay, all I would say is that doesn't tell you, that doesn't actually link. That is something that happens after you've linked the data to an entity, right? So once you link a data to an entity, you can say, therefore you have rights in relation to that data because you something, right? It doesn't. It's a circular thing if it's being defined. Like you have rights if you have rights isn't an answer, right?
I'm going to suggest that in the interest of time we call it deuce and we return to that.
In any event, I say because this list was only about law enforcement agencies, it doesn't include being a data subject. So we have to add that one. I was going to add that one in a minute, right? Because this was not, law enforcement agencies aren't data subjects, but you can add that one. You can say you're a data subject and that gives you rights, right? Because the data is about you. That's another link between data and an entity, me, right? But I still think rights, powers, obligations is something that comes after you've linked, after you've connected an entity with some information on some kind of basis. Mostly this was looking at obligations, not rights, because that's mostly what law enforcement has. But I think we should be clear about which entity has obligations for which data, and I don't think the current morass of terminology gets us very far. So now the other point to make is you can copy data and then have a different relationship with the copied data compared to the original data. You can derive data and you can have a different relationship with the derived data from the original data. So every time something happens to data, the entities that have relationships with it might change, right, for that new derived or copied data. But I still think we can do with a lot less words than this list. And this list still doesn't include rights, so it doesn't even help there. So transparency about the rules. We had a team of researchers with the Data to Decision CRC working for years, and we couldn't come up with a full description of the entire legal framework because we couldn't even get access to the internal data governance documents. What that means is effectively the legal framework is non-transparent. Unless you're an expert, and even if you are, it's a bit of a black box. That gives rise to 2 kinds of problems. One is BOTPA, right? People just say, I can't do this because privacy, right? And because privacy is something no one seems to understand, these conversations don't go anywhere. And I've had ridiculous conversations like energy companies and so forth calling me up and saying, hi, we're calling from energy company X. Can you please verify your identity? We can't tell you anything about why we're calling until you tell us who you are and your date of birth and your mother's maiden name and da-da-da-da-da. That is the most cyber insecure conversations taking place all around Australia I could ever imagine happening. The risk that I'm not who I am when you're calling my phone is much, much lower than the risk that you're not really calling from Energy Australia or whatever, right? So we need to really clarify laws so people actually do the right thing by privacy law and not just stupid, ridiculous things. The other reason we need it, and this was because the study was about law enforcement, is that actually there is some appropriate information. If there is some information that needs to be shared between agencies, between national security and law enforcement agencies so that they can be effective. There have been a quinzillion committees, reviews, etc., that have all said we are not doing that well in Australia at the moment. All of them say, oh, it's because of culture, risk-averse culture. I actually think when you talk to people and you talk to people in those agencies, at least one of the reasons why agencies are not sharing, when it's appropriate, I'm not talking about inappropriate sharing, is that the legal regime is so complicated that no one wants to screw it up, because if you screw it up, you go to jail. The penalties are really high for getting it wrong. So realistically, where you do want information to be shared, the complexity of the legal regime slows you down. Where you do want protection, and you do actually want people to be protected, the complexity of the legal regime is actually undermining that by making people less secure and their data more at risk. So you basically have to simplify it. It should be that you can have different categories of data, extreme high risk to extreme low risk, all dealt with through one common language. You can have different rules about what happens to the high risk data, but you can absolutely have common language. We can use very simple words. Okay, sorry, I went over. Malcolm.
I was going to say, let's deal with the opposite of what you've just said. Do you realise that the Privacy Act doesn't have a definition of privacy in it? There is a definition of a breach of privacy, and that's essentially a failure to observe a series of process rules. And the construct of the law is such that there's a series of process rules that, if followed, are alleged without proof to lead to an improvement in a concept called privacy that's not defined. Cool, huh? Okay, I'll move along. This is a fairly short session because, to a degree, it just summarises where we've been. When we multiply complexity of implementation with complexity in the law, we really have got a multiplication result, not just an additive result. And because I'm not going to go over it again, I've got here, don't mention robo-debt. We can all name our own pet peeve. I've listed a few here. Now, the job seeker allowance is clearly driving people crazy. In disability, NDIS, there's endless complaints about NDIS process, whether it's lack of resources or too much form filling or just about anything else. My family had to go through booking an ECAT for an aged parent where up front we said to them, we know there is sufficient income in the family that there will be no income support here. We just want the test. They said, no, you've got to fill in the 12-page form to prove that your family is earning too much to not claim any income support. And as Lyria mentioned, there's an awful lot of BOTPA around, which seems to often become shorthand for laziness, don't want to find out, shorthand for risk aversion, that saying no is vastly safer than saying yes. So one of the examples that I know of is one of the partner of one of our members of staff in landing in the USA on a Friday evening, was discovered by the person at Los Angeles airport behind the desk to have an undischarged arrest warrant from, 10 or 20 years ago. The partner had a letter from the Australian consulate that explained why that was the case and everything was okay. The person behind the desk had two options: wave through the partner and let that partner just get along with his life, or take the cautious approach and put the person into custody. Now, option A, which is let the person go, carries risk for that particular member of staff behind the counter if they've made the wrong mistake. If instead they say you're going into custody, the guy behind the counter can quietly go home and have his beer as he was going to anyway and never think about it again. But the result for the partner was, because the federal institutions were full and it was Friday evening, he was put into Los Angeles County Jail with all the druggies and heavy-hitting crims for days on end, while the person who was working for us, our member of staff, spent $10,000 that they will never see again on lawyers, and the Australian consulate in California was on the phone non-stop screaming at people to get him out of jail. And when he was discharged after midnight. And do you know why he was discharged after midnight? Because Los Angeles County Jail is paid by the night by the feds for storing people who are subject to federal jurisdiction. So by letting him go after midnight, they got paid for one more night of looking after this guy. The story's got many more bits of richness to it. It's an extraordinary process of risk shifting, and it's really a very strong example of blame it on something else, but go home and have a beer. So I would love to just open up the audio again, the microphones again, for literally only a couple of minutes of the first person on the hooter to yell out what they think their pet peeve is in regards to complexity in implementing complex law. And I'll ask Lyria to capture those, and should there be something worth remembering for the summit, we'll make sure it goes into the summit as an example. So open up your microphones, people, and start telling us what your pet peeve is about complexity in implementing complex law.
I've got one, which is trying to unsubscribe from unwanted emails that started coming to a private email address instead of a work email address previously given. And I was told, even though I hit the unsubscribe, that they wouldn't unsubscribe unless I gave them my date of birth to confirm my identity, so they could change their records to say not to subscribe.
And there's one that's closely related to that. Have you ever tried to get your credit record or credit report from any of the credit providers? The amount of information they will require from you before they'll give you your credit report, which they're obliged to give you, by the way, free of charge. They try and trick you into paying for it, but they're obliged by law to give it to you free of charge, means that you're going through a whole series of questions that helps them add to their database and enrich their database and add to the reliability of their database, while they claim it's all about identity protection. Now, there's another round or two in that debate to go, so no, I won't expand any further, but you are so right. In order to get off a list, you've got to be on a list. Any other questions? Any other observations? That was a good one.
I quite liked, it's Kath T here, quite like the fallacy that my health record was anything to do with me.
Yes, it should be called your health record held by the government.
Correct.
Or the government health record.
Malcolm, it's Kaz. How you going?
G'day, how are you? Welcome back.
Good, thanks. Lyria, you've been a delight to listen to as well. My current pet peeve, and Malcolm has known me for a few years, so he knows that I have lots of them, but is in the current world of COVID, everyone's become a privacy expert or a security expert. So it's the opposite of what Lyria was saying before about, well, nobody really understands privacy. I'm dealing with the opposite of it. And it is incredibly frustrating to just full stop. I'll just leave it there.
Experts who aren't expert, I think, is the way of summarising that. And that is what
frustrating.
Yeah, and it leads to an awful lot of bot power as a result too. Thank you, everybody. I think we probably need to move along. We've got half an hour to go. We've got a little bit more presentation, and then we're going to have something of a free-for-all. One of the issues that we spend a lot of time thinking about is whatever we've got at the moment doesn't work too well for a whole bunch of reasons. Is there a better way? And the assertion that I want to make is that in thinking about that, there is more thought to be done on law reform, the use of standards and accountability for whatever the framework puts in place. And as Lyria said quite early on, I will allege that both the European Global General Data Protection Regulation and the Californian Consumer Privacy Act are frankly the best privacy laws ever written to deal with 20th century problems. They're simply not fit for the 21st century. GDPR in particular is loaded with process, and it's not entirely clear that all of those processes are needed or are hitting the mark. And on top of that, the regulators said at the time the law was being introduced that they were grossly underfunded to do the job. And there's been some recent writings that say it's been stony silence by and large on ordinary enforcement of GDPR. Yes, there's some headline enforcements, but there's not a lot. And I suspect that if you repeated the surveys that have already been done in Europe of business in Europe to find out how many businesses in Europe are even aware of GDPR, let alone applying it properly, it's probably 75% are still unaware that the law even exists. The other factor that we have to deal with is something that Lyria hinted at early on, which is the universal notice and choice model is simply a busted flush. It doesn't work the way it's been made to work. It's being knowingly, not unknowingly, knowingly misused to mislead the public. There's all sorts of ways we can talk about that. One of the interesting things is that because a lot of companies are subject primarily to American law, they're therefore bound by the Federal Trade Commission Act. And in particular, there's a section there called Section 5, which is very similar to our misleading and deceptive conduct requirement. And the Federal Trade Commission about 20 years ago now literally tricked a lot of business into making a promise so that if they broke the promise, they could be prosecuted, because otherwise there was literally no privacy law. So they got American businesses to start putting out privacy notices so that then there was something that they'd made by way of public promise against which they could be prosecuted if they didn't perform. And it's really from there that this whole business of seeking, giving you a privacy notice, and then either by ignoring it or clicking yes, you've agreed to the thing, and then hence off you go. And then you can be prosecuted as a company if you don't meet the requirements of your privacy policy. It's turned into a process whereby, you can be forced to read, if you want to, up to 30 pages of privacy notices. And yet the executive summary of almost all of those notices is a simple sentence. And many people have heard me say it before. Most of those privacy notices are very simple. We'll collect everything about that you can, in any way that we can, from anywhere that we can. We will keep it forever, and we'll sell it to anybody and use it for anything. And the whole point of those privacy policies is to maximise the degree of freedom that they give themselves. The European privacy regulators in particular have frustratingly tried to say notice and choice is one of 6 channels by which you can legally process data in Europe, including some quite large other exceptions. But most businesses has just wildly ignored all of that and kept on using notice and choice. And it's gone wrong. It's gone badly wrong. And now the policymakers and the regulators around the world are waking up to this, even though, I first saw this issue being discussed 15 years ago plus. This was going to go wrong or was already wrong. But I'll give you one of the current examples, which is the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission's Digital Platforms Inquiry. And I've given there some quotes, so I won't go through them any more than that. But the point of those quotes is to show that even ACCC has finally begun to understand that notice and choice, guys, simply ain't working. ACCC's treatment of that is, well, frankly, hilarious. Namely, the notices need to be better than they were, and hence from there you'll make a better informed choice. And it ignores all the other conditions that are required for any form of consent to work, which is that the individual has to be fully informed and the decision has to be freely given. When most of the notice and choices are take it or leave it, when there's no way that most people can possibly understand the legalese that they've been given, there's a massive power disparity between the giver of the notice and the receiver of the notice, and a whole lot of other things that mean that notice and choice is not going to work. People should find other solutions. And we'll go on to the next slide, because we can actually see that there are better ways. And the amazing thing is that outside of the world of data, there is a model that is used again and again and again and again. And it's got 5 components to it, at least, and I've listed them there. The first thing is that somewhere out of the ether there is a credible framework, whether you call it a framework or rules or standards or laws or whatever it is. There's a statement of the way things should be done, which hopefully also includes a statement of the way things shouldn't be done. And that's been written by a competent, independent, trustworthy third party. And that could be the Parliament, writing an Act of Parliament. It could be the Standards Australia, or it could be the International Standards people, or it could be the IEEE, or it could be any number of folks who claim to come up with credible frameworks. In the case of the motor car industry, there are the Australian design rules. There's a whole set of standards for building roads. There's a whole set of standards for making airplanes. There's a whole set of standards for people who can get a pilot's license. There's a whole set of standards for anybody who can be a doctor. Even the building that you're sitting in right now has been subject to any number of standards. And we find that when those standards are flouted, things can happen. The fires that have happened in a number of buildings where cladding of the buildings has been not up to standard proves how lethal the failure of some of compliance with standards can be. But there was a standard there. The second component is that there's credible testing against standard. And again, by competent, independent, trustworthy third parties who are not the same as the rule makers. The rule testers and the rule makers have to be different from each other. But in that context, for example, you have to be clever in writing these frameworks and who writes them. And I'll continue to say Parliament has never yet designed a motor car because it knew it wasn't the right body to do it. Parliament did say you're not allowed to sell a motor car in Australia unless it meets a standard. Parliament did say there shall be a standards testing body and there shall be a standards setting body. And then Parliament stands back with the experts doing it and off you go. What is also interesting is that the funding of those processes is usually by the entities themselves, whether it's the motor car companies making the processes to test motor cars, or whether it's the examination processes for doctors, or whether it's the auditors to audit financial statements. It's all the same model. There's a framework, there's an auditor or a tester, and there is a funding process that comes from the entities that want to make use of those things and sell product. Very different from data privacy. Consent is kept as a precious resource to be used where it matters, and not for all the myriad things hundreds of times a day that if the privacy laws in Australia were properly in place, enforced and obeyed, we'd be doing consents hundreds of times a day. But let me give you an example. Many of us at some stage in our lives, for example, may need a joint replacement. So I'll just use a knee replacement as an example. Yes, you will decide when you need the knee replacement, basically when the pain gets too great or there's something else that makes you make the decision to have the knee replacement. You may even decide who your surgeon will be and possibly even the hospital that you will go to. But you will not choose the particular prosthesis that gets installed. You will not choose the scalpel. You will not choose the anaesthetic. You may or may not choose the person who does the anaesthesis. But there are literally going to have been thousands and thousands of decisions made with regard to that knee replacement that you weren't even told about, let alone asked to make a decision about because you were not competent to make the decision and you couldn't possibly have spent the time to find out. So you make the decisions on the things that matter and the things that are competent, that you're competent to make decisions about. We just have not brought that to data. We can give many, many, many more examples. And the fifth example I think I've already really mentioned, which is that often the standards and frameworks are enforced by law unless there's a strong economic driver. So, for example, credit ratings are not actually enforced by law simply because there's a sufficiently strong market in borrowing and lending that you don't need a law to have all that in place. The frameworks and rules are written without a backing law because there's something else that makes it work. But it's a model that it's actually very hard to come up with any part of the complexity of your life that is not driven by that framework and made safe for you literally by third parties you never met, you don't know, and you've never discussed things with, but you trust them with your life. That's the standard model. We're just not applying it to data. So let's turn over to the next slide, because we do actually have glimpses of that kind of framework in privacy law now. Credit reporting and credit scoring, for example, in Australia is covered by the Privacy Act in Part 3A, and there are now some other non-privacy laws that have huge privacy impact around with regard to credit reporting and lending. And there you have no choice. A credit report will be made about you whether you like it or not. You've got some other rights. You can ask to access the credit report. You can seek changes to the credit report to correct errors and so forth, but you have no choice. That credit report will be written about you. I could again go on, but that BOTPAR and complexity have been introduced onto credit reporting. At one stage, there was the credit reporting merry-go-round where each lender, each borrower, each lender and each credit reporting agency would all point their finger at each other and say, if there's a mistake in their records, you've got to talk to the other guys. Another one that I think works really very well is health research that uses personal information. The framework is established by the National Health and Medical Research Council in consultation with OAIC via the National Statement on the Ethical Conduct in Human Research and the Section 95A guidelines under the Privacy Act. There'll be people who say it's not working well, it could be better. Of course, all of those things, but generally for 99% of the population, it's worked extraordinarily well to keep us safe. We're having to think about how we bend the arrangements right now for the COVID vaccines and other treatments that people want to test on a rapidly accelerating basis. But we are massively introducing additional risk into those systems if we do it. And the reason why we do it the way it is set out in the National Statement and the 95A guidelines is to make it a very safe process under normal circumstances. And then the entity that applies all of those rules are the Health Research Ethics Committees, duly constituted in accordance with NHMRC requirements. So we already see this kind of standards making, standards testing, application of standard, enforcement of in privacy law, or at least in law that deals with personal information. So now let me turn around to the next slide, which is getting very close to one of the last ones, to say, again, we're seeing this debate begin to work its way through. There is a recently introduced Privacy Score Act of 2020, which is currently before Congress, almost certainly not going to pass, but the point is, at least somebody's thinking. And it would basically set up a framework for saying there shall be privacy scores, and then there shall be a framework about applying those privacy scores. It's not new thinking. Our company, Information Integrity Solutions, was the catalyst to establishing a thing called the Privacy and Trust Partnership in 2007. Yes. Hello. No, that was somebody accidentally pressed their unmute button. Privacy and Trust Partnership suggested there ought to be a privacy and security rating, or a P&S rating, and the joke in that is that there's already the S&P rating for credit scoring, Standard & Poor's. The P&S rating would be the corresponding thing for privacy and security, and the paper that we created at the time goes into that in more detail. If we circulate this PowerPoint presentation after this webinar, each of those blue underlined components are in fact clickable links so that you go and read more if you like. There's also the Information Accountability Foundation in the USA, which is headed up by Marty Abrams, with whom I've done a lot of work over the years, and he's come up recently with what he calls the demonstrable accountability arrangement. And again, you can click there for some work that he did with the Canadian government on demonstrable accountability that is enforced by law, and it's well worth reading. So the idea of setting up scoring, creating a scoring process, creating a score testing process, and making it accountable and enforceable, the thinking's already there. I think I'm going to have to leave it in the time available to a rhetorical question and say to you, start thinking about how does COVID safe stack up against some of these new kinds of thinking. because we do want to give some time to Lyria's thoughts on data ethics frameworks as a contributor to how we deal with data in the future. But I will finish off by saying that I think there are some promising ethics frameworks. That's the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI produced by some people in Europe for the European Commission. And there are others that are truly appalling, like the one developed by the Department of Industry and CSIRO, Data 61. But the point is there's a hot debate on what that ethics framework should look like. Peter Leonard, who's been in this call, is somebody who's put a lot of time into thinking about what some of that should look like, for example. But there's a hot debate over the value of these kinds of frameworks, their utility, their implementation, their enforcement. Are they, in fact, leading to what some people have called ethics washing? Namely, you set up an ethics committee, you say that you've put your processes through an ethics committee, you therefore say that your hands are clean and you get along and do with what you were going to do anyway, but in reality, you've just done a bit of a hand-waving exercise. I'd like to hand it over to Lyria for the last part of today's webinar. Lyria, you may have to come off mute.
Sorry, yes, off mute. Okay, sorry about that. There'll be a very quick final point about ethics that I wanted to make. So I guess I don't mind ethics if we did it for everything. I'm a bit suspicious when we only talk about it for data or AI or whatever. So, and the kinds of things we talk about, if you think about ethics, right, you've got the philosophical ethics where you can have the big debates, you know, what is the right thing to do if, blah, 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 is this the right way, methodology to make ethical decisions, or is that the right methodology? And then you've got applied ethics, right, which is really helping people make good, concrete decisions, helping programmers and so forth. Now, the challenge I have with most of the ethics frameworks is that they're at a very high level, do no harm, be transparent, but they're not fulfilling the role of that lower level, which is a programmer is working for a company who says, get as much data as you can and use it for this. It's not actually helping them know what to do about that. So here's my view, right? You've got the high level principles, and I've already said, I think they're really important, right? I think accountability, transparency, or, you know, do no harm, all of those words matter. They absolutely matter, but they matter as ways to evaluate two things. You can evaluate law, regulatory frameworks, that kind of stuff, and you can say, does that provide a good accountability framework, for example? And you can evaluate systems, right? Or procurement standards and design standards that go into systems that are built and say, does that meet these high standards? You can then think about the sort of detailed stuff you want to tell people, right, who are building the systems to help them build the systems in ways that comply with the high level principles, right? But where does ethics sit for me? Ethics is about people, right? Systems aren't ethical. They can be accountable and transparent and lots of other good things, but they're not ethical. Ethical is something that usually is used to describe how people act in the world. And you absolutely want ethical people, right? With thoughtful people trying to do the right thing, guided by such principles as we can give them, but you want them throughout all of it, right? It's not like a list of principles is going to make ethical people. So that's my view on ethics. Others will have different views, but I don't want to hog the conversation. What we wanted to do now is open it up and get everyone's views. I don't know if we have it's not letting me end the presentation. What I'm going to do, and hopefully you can still see my screen, is just open a Word document. Can everyone see that? Do I need bigger font maybe? And then just try to capture everyone's ideas. Go.
Are you able to
you begin, just in the bottom right hand of your screen, you can enlarge that, magnify it, just so we can all see.
Much better. Much better.
Okay. Mark, is there anything in the chat to start us off?
Nothing so far in the chat.
What I think we're listening for at this stage is you know, for me anyway, and I keep on saying Lyria and I aren't necessarily in heated agreement on some of this, is an intention here to be provocative rather than anything else. So is the framework that we presented in the previous slide, the print called Privacy Law for the 21st Century, or the framework summary that is in the last slide, Is that a start point for reframing privacy law for the 21st century? Should we start somewhere else again, or should we simply adopt GDPR in this country and spend $1 gazillion on regulators to enforce a GDPR? Or is there a third way? We'd be really interested, especially for input to the Minister and his thinking that comes out of the summit next week. What should we be doing with privacy law in this country so that it's both effective and facilitating? None of us want secrecy and living like hermits with flint-based, wooden-handled axes. We do want data. We do want this world to work. The government has just come up with something for the COVID Safe app that is a much stronger privacy framework than would normally be the case for federal government initiatives, regardless of whether you think they're good enough or not. They're at least an awful lot better than we've often seen. So what do we need to do that privacy law for the 20th century with do nothing actually being a valid answer? We'd be very interested to hear what others here have got to say. Unmute, start talking, folks.
Hi, I've unmuted. Don't know if this
You
is
are
Therese
unmuted
Anderson.
now. Excellent.
Hi. Thanks so much for your for this engaging masterclass. I'm probably preempting where you can imagine I'm going to go tomorrow night, but I think because in the 21st century what we have are so many more channels open for engaging with expertise defined in so many different ways. And here it's not just, and I think COVID Safe is an illustration of this. Yes, there might be authorities who are evaluating and reviewing, but making use of our open channels to enable more transparent engagement, not just in terms of experts that are considered authoritative in terms of law or authoritative in terms of technology, but maybe social experts, representatives from various sectors of the community that may feel particularly vulnerable, who are not generally engaged in our normal society because they are already so disenfranchised. They're even more disenfranchised when the conversations don't seem to connect to them. So I think it's that idea of using those channels, but I appreciate also what you said about, you can't be asking permission for everything. Imagine it would be hard to get out the door if I have to ask for a pass at every stage.
There's a little joke that I saw recently that was saying, when did the passengers of the aircraft last have a committee meeting to decide the route that the aircraft would take and how to fly the plane? You actually simply have to rely on the expertise. On other occasions, you have to draw in the expertise, and you're so right, for example, about some of the disadvantaged groups. In the International Year of, was it called the International Year of Disabled, or was it the International Year with some other title? But suddenly, all building standards got an extra bit in there that said you've got to have an entry ramp. And we were building entry ramps all over the country. But for decades, people who only could move on wheels and couldn't use legs couldn't get up into an awful lot of buildings in the country without somebody else helping them. Very sadly, with that example, we've gone and forgotten it again, and there's now most buildings are built without ramps, and we're almost sliding back to square one. But Teresa, it's an extremely good example of what you're saying, that even when it comes to building standards, we need to listen more widely. Yeah. We need to listen to the experts, but we need to listen more widely.
And I think that goes to what Peter has just put into the chat around a Charter of Human Rights, this idea of identifying fundamental principles that we consider inalienable rights. And so access, inclusivity, diversity, if you had those sorts of practices fundamentally a part of the fabric of design, and designed by humans, and then code being a proxy for human behavior, that perhaps might enable a multitude of voices to come in. And on that note, I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to mute again, so other voices come in.
Thank you.
Peter has raised that New South Wales can start with the Charter of Human Rights, just like Queensland and Victoria, which would be an easy and quick step forward.
And they don't have to wait for the federal government to decide it's going to do something like that. because could be awaiting a long time at the moment.
So this is a point against the Charter of Human Rights as such, because and this was raised by someone in Q&A, so this is not an original. Well, the USA is a great example of a country that has a very strict, in some ways, a Charter of Rights, the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. And what started happening there is when it comes to really key decisions, and it's almost like the legislated institutions have started being sidestepped, and it's the Supreme Court that ends up making their decisions, often for good, whether that's legalizing same-sex marriage or some of the other things. But it's almost, we live in a representative some political system, and what that has done there, it's gone too far, and it's often Supreme Court instead of, there's a gridlock in the Senate and in their legislative bodies, and it's often the Supreme Court that ends up making their decisions, and that might be a good thing, but often goes against the fundamental democratic principles.
Yeah, good point. Yep, I'd have to say that that calls into play a little principle that I talk about quite often, which is that gaming the rules is one of the rules of the game. That it doesn't matter what's written down, people are going to, or institutions are going to find a way around it, or a novel interpretation that many others would argue is completely against the original spirit of what was written down. It's an extraordinarily hard, difficult concept to deal with, but for example, in the First Amendment in the USA, I don't think the founding fathers really thought about the fact that whether or not an incorporated entity, an inanimate but nevertheless legal entity, has the First Amendment rights of free speech, because that is what has grossly undone a whole lot of the processes that people thought were available to make sure that one could speak freely and not be overridden by large entities that would simply come in and scoop up all the information and then publish it, and if challenged on it, would be saying, hang on, what about our First Amendment rights?
I think Charter of Rights is a big question, Malcolm. We've only got 60 seconds left. We might see if there's any other.
Okay.
Can I join in? This is Kim. I quite like the sort of framework that Malcolm, you were setting out, with a credible framework, credible testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But just to play devil's advocate for a minute, is there an argument that the Privacy Act originally tried to do something like that? Like it tried to set up some principles, and then you were allowed to have, special codes of privacy, which, should have been for specific industries, which could have been taken control of by those industries. So is the real problem that we're having a lot of trouble actually setting what that baseline is? We need a different baseline set of principles from the ones we have, which are built around consent, etc. But how are we going to get agreement on those?
I was there as Privacy Commissioner when all that was going on, and the original intention of the government at the time was really what you've just said, which is that by and large most economic sectors would create their own privacy codes, but just in case one of them didn't quite get around to it, we'd set up a set of baseline privacy principles just in case as a default backwards, that most of the economic sectors would set up their own privacy adjudicators of some sort, and off things would go from there. The trouble was most businesses rapidly saw that you either took the law as it stood free of charge, and you took the regulator as it stood free of charge, or you spent money creating and quite expensively because of the process required in the law for coming up with a privacy code. You had to spend money developing the privacy code, and then you had to spend continuous money enforcing the code with your own enforcer. And most industries had the common sense to say, that's not much of a bargain at all, is it? The difference with financial information frameworks as opposed to personal information frameworks is that there isn't a free offer around to bust the model. So if you basically said that there shall be an independent code making body, the problem with the baseline privacy principles, the APPs as they currently stand, is they're utterly static, and the ability to bring them along through time is massively slowed down because the Parliament designed and wrote those principles. You know, it breaches the rule of Parliament doesn't design motor cars. Parliament's designed the framework. It's very difficult to change it. If instead you had a standard setting body like you have for the accounting standards or for just about anything else, then those could move more rapidly to solve problems. And if you then said, should you as a business want to deal in personal information, you've got to pay up for the appropriate accountability processes just as you have to do now for your financial audits. So yes, the model was got half right, but with all the wrong incentives in there in the Privacy Act. Does that answer your question? Not much, she says.
Malcolm,
Well, I mean, yes and no, because the point remains that how do we set the baselines? Like, what is the things you can and cannot do?
Yep.
But I guess your answer to that would be, well, that's the credible expert's role.
Yep. That's the way. Well, my rebuttable proposition is that's the way we've done it in so many other arenas. Can somebody come up with a better model? Now,
Malcolm,
yes.
Sorry, Malcolm and Lyria, I at least have to jump off and go to my next meeting, but I'd like to thank you very much for running our first masterclass, and it was as interesting and exciting and wide-ranging as I had hoped. For everybody who has remained on the call, this is the first in a series of 4 masterclasses leading up to the New South Wales Privacy Summit, which is now an online event, a little bit reduced in scale and scope from what we originally planned. The event takes place on the 8th of May, and the intention is to surface as many issues as possible so that we really have a meaningful conversation on the day. My name was Ian Opperman. I didn't introduce myself. My apologies for turning up late. I will dial off, and we are now effectively, I would say, in the after the meeting conversation. So people are interested should stick around and debate with Lyria and Malcolm for as long as they can. But I leave you very, very much with thanks for today.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And just to add to that for everybody, so we do have a session tomorrow, which is being hosted by Teresa Anderson and Verity Firth. This is on building public trust in data collection, storage and use. So if you haven't registered for that, please do so through the link which you registered for this event. But please feel free to stick around for as long as Lyria and Malcolm have time for. Sorry, and just one other point, tonight's slides have been added into the chat as well. So thank you for Malcolm and Lyria for putting those together and making those available. So if you'd like to download, they are available in the chat.
Okay. We may have exhausted them, Lyria.
That's okay. It's been 2 hours. It's long enough for anyone, I think.
Lyria and Malcolm, if you'd like to open up the chat, we've got a few things coming through. Maybe for everybody, maybe best to come off chat and just to come onto mic, make it a little bit easier.
I was going to say it's a fantastic conversation that could go on all night if it wasn't for the fact that many of us have other hats that we're wearing as well, especially as we're all in isolation at home.
But then, of course, the conversation is going to go on because we've got several more of these to keep talking at.
Well, that's true.
Yes.
Well, no, and I have had a smile on my face throughout most of the masterclass because without even having, I'm sure this was all in Ian's plan, but it feels like tomorrow will be a natural extension of the discussion from today in terms of the complexities. As you were just saying, Malcolm, you know, there are these rules that are set, and as Kim, you were flagging how you set the baselines and who determines who the credible expert is, and what do we agree, if we agree at all, is what is expertise and what is relevant expertise.
I think those are all fantastically good questions. I'm probably just going to simply assert that they are solved problems in other domains, and that the real issue is that we haven't put the effort in with regard to data governance, if you like, to get there. I'm not saying we can do it overnight. It could actually be a 5-year discussion. Now, it could really require a lot of hard work. It could be that we say that things like ISO 27701 is the start point. Now, what do we really want? But, you know, there's an awful lot of interest groups that had nothing to do with the writing of that standard. And by that, I don't just mean vulnerable groups. They certainly are probably not well represented in that discussion, but there'll be an awful lot of other interests that haven't been present there as well. So maybe 27701 is not the right place to start. Maybe they're the wrong sort of experts. The people who said before that we should actually bring in humans as opposed to code cutters have got a really good, sorry, apologies to all code cutters, by the way. But you know what I mean. There is a wide range to be dealt with. But I think we've got to start. It's a classic case of if it's going to take us 5 years to solve the problem and we don't start, it'll take 5 years to solve the problem when we do start. So let's start now. By the way,
I guess
Mark,
sorry.
Somebody has said that that download link doesn't work. I don't know why, but I've tried to download it and it doesn't work either.
Yeah, I just tried it too and it doesn't work for me.
We'll talk to Mark later, I think, and see if we can fix it.
What I'll do is I'll
make
make this. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on, but I will make a central point available to everyone who's joined the classes, which will have all the content as well as the videos, the recordings that we've had. So I'll try and set something up for that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're rapidly dropping off. I can see the numbers going down. It's about, as I speak, the numbers keep on going down. So should we close the conversation, or is there something anybody would like to make either in the chat room or elsewhere?
I think I wanted to jump and ask one question of you, Malcolm, with the comment you just made that this problem has been solved in other areas. Because as a social informaticist, I would say the problem is unsolvable in terms of, oh, well, that sounds bad now. It's not that it's unsolvable, it's that there is no singular solution. And that when I think keeping channels open, regardless of whether or not you have a set of experts and agreed expertise. I think the participant who made the comment about the United States and the fact that there is supposedly a charter of so-called the Declaration of Independence and the inalienable rights that led to the Constitution and so on and so forth, show that discussion has to be dynamic. So, yes. I'm a big believer in standards. It's a pity Ian's not on the call to see. Yes, I believe in standards. But standards are ongoing conversation. So I'm interested in knowing if you have a specific example in mind of an industry where you think they have it cracked.
Have or have not?
No, have, because you were saying that you thought that other areas have solved this problem. And so...
I actually meant things like motor car design or even doctoring. And we've got to remember that it's only a century or so back, maybe 150 years, that doctors treated people with mercury because at the time that was considered to be the best thing you could do. We only discovered later that applying mercury killed people. It was the Hippocratic Oath that actually said those doctors in an ethical sense, even though they were prescribing mercury, were doing the right thing in a Hippocratic sense, because in terms of the knowledge of the day, they were doing the right thing. They were doctors, and yet it would have been chemists who were able to point out the lethal nature of mercury. One of the things that's in the motor car standards is fuel efficiency. Now, fuel efficiency has just got nothing to do with motor car safety, but California for years pushed the drive towards more fuel efficient motor cars by inserting into the standards that they required the requirement for an increasingly fuel efficient fleet. And by inserting that in there, the fleet got more fuel efficient. It wasn't necessarily motor car designers that put it in there. So there are poor examples that I can think of off the top of my head where the experts had to listen to others, even if some of those others were experts in their own right. But even disability access to buildings, for example, is a classic case of the engineers going ahead and coming up with engineering standards for buildings, but eventually being forced to consider non-engineering issues such as accessibility to buildings, and then they go into the standards. So it's probably about properly designing the process of who you, and the health research ethics committees are a classic example. I don't know if you've ever looked at the approved requirements for having a health research ethics committee, but the membership includes, and you don't have a valid health research ethics committee until you have the different roles filled. There has to be the lawyer, there has to be the researcher, there has to be the person of religion, there has to be the lay person. I can't remember them all, but my point is that's a highly heterogeneous group by design that comes forward to think about the ethics of whether or not particular research on humans should be conducted. Maybe HRECs are in fact the best answer to your question.
Yeah, that's actually one of the models that I tend to use. That, and as an ethnographer, I think anytime you're dealing with human subjects, and basically if we're wandering through the world, we're dealing with human subjects, not as subjects but as humans. So thinking about how to move forward.
Yes.
It would make sense to take that in mind, but it also shows, I mean, the values change. So you take your motor car example, when you're working with a petrol engine as opposed to an electrical engine, medicine, thinking about, I've been looking at some interesting work about the different ways that the classification of chronic fatigue syndrome and even getting the label to not be used has an impact. And again, the only way that comes into the realm of knowledge is by keeping an open mind and allowing for the admission of omission. So I think that goes to the earlier observation you were making about what I think of as mistakeism, and the fact that you don't get brownie points for admitting that something went wrong, when in fact we should be finding ways. It's not that you should be deliberately making mistakes. You certainly try to avoid as many mistakes as possible, but what conventions are in place so that when we work out something hasn't gone according to plan.
Yes. Did you see the interview of Dr. Harris from Geneva? I think it was on 7:30 on ABC last night. It'll be available on iView now. But what she said and how she said it was extraordinarily good. She was basically saying the World Health Organization every time basically conducts an ex post review. The whole idea is to expose what went right and what could be done better. The whole idea is to be open and honest and transparent about it. And the whole idea is not to sack anybody. Now, there's no finger pointing. It's all inclusive and progressing further to do better. It takes, something went. Often you see the first reaction, especially in the political arena, is the first reaction is when something goes wrong, there's got to be somebody you sack. It's absolutely the wrong thing to do if you want to make progress and have people come forward and say, look, there's been an oops here. I may or may not have contributed to it, or I simply have spotted it. But what will we do about it? And everybody says, gee whiz, haven't we all got the problem? And let's resolve it, as opposed to the frequent shoot the messenger problem that we have instead.
Or the CYA, the covering your own assets. So that's the other thing that.
Indeed. Yep. Yeah.
You can tell who's worked in politics, yes. Or government.
Yes, we have. All right, everybody.
I'm gonna head off because of the time, but thank you so much, both of you. I really enjoyed a lot of that, and you've given me a lot of things to think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much from me too, Simeon, from Simeon too. Thank you.